Chapter 8 of Afloat on the Ohio, an historical pilgrimage of 1,000 miles in a skiff, from Redstone to Cairo. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Hoffman. Afloat on the Ohio, by Reuben Thwaites. Chapter 8 Life Ashore and Afloat. Marietta, the Plymouth Rock of the West. The Little Kanawha. The Story of Blennerhassett's Island. Blennerhassett's Island, Sunday, May 13th. The day broke without fog at our camp on the rocky steep above Marietta. The eastern sky was veiled with summer clouds, all gaily flushed by the rising sun, and in the serene silence of the morning there hung the scent of dew, and earth, and trees. In the east, the distant edges of the West Virginia hills were aglow with the mounting light before it had yet passed over into the river trough, where a silvery haze lent peculiar charm to flood and bank. Upriver, one of the three brother isles, dark and heavily forested, seemed in the middle ground to float on air. A bewitching picture this, until at last the sun sprang clear and strong above the fringing hills, and the spell was broken. The steamboat traffic is improving as we get lower down. Last evening, between landing and bedtime, a half-dozen passed us, up and down, breathing heavily as dragons might, and leaving behind them foamy wakes which loudly broke upon the shore. Before morning, I was at intervals awakened by as many more. A striking spectacle, the passage of a big river steamer in the night. You hear, fast approaching, a labored pant. Suddenly, around the bend, or emerging from behind an island, the long white monster glides into view, lanterns gleaming on two lines of deck, her electric searchlight uneasily flitting to and fro, first on one landmark, then on another, her engine bell sharply clanging, the measured pant developing into a burly, all-pervading roar, which gradually declines into a pant again, and then she disappears as she came, her swelling wake rudely ruffling the moonlit stream. We caught up with a large lumber craft this morning, descending from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati. The half-dozen men in charge were housed midway in a rude little shanty, and relieved each other at the sweeps, two at bow and two astern. It is an easy, lounging life most of the way, with some difficulties in the shallows, and in passing beneath the great bridges. They travel night and day, except in the not infrequent windstorms blowing upon the stream, and it will take them another week to cover the 300 miles between this and their destination. Far different fellow these commonplace raftsmen of today from the lumber boys of a half-century or more ago, when the river towns were regularly painted red by the men who followed the Ohio by raft or flatboat. Life along shore was then more picturesque than comfortable. Later, we stopped on the Ohio shore to chat with a group of farmers having a Sunday talk, their seat a drift log, in the shade of a willowed bank. They proved to be market gardeners and fruit growers, well-to-do men of their class, and intelligent in conversation, all of them descendants of the sturdy New Englanders who settled these parts. While the others were discussing small fruits with these transplanted Yankees, who proved quite as full of curiosity about us as we concerning them, I went down shore 100 yards, struggling through the dense fringe of willows, to photograph a junk boat just putting off into the stream. The two rough-bearded, merry-eyed fellows at the sweeps were setting their craft broadside to the stream, that, "the current might have more holt of her," the chief explained. They were interested in the kodak, and readily posed as I wished, but wanted to see what had been taken, having the common notion that it is like a tintype camera, with results at once attainable. They offered our party a ride for the rest of the day if we would row alongside and come aboard, but I thanked them, saying their craft was too slow for our needs, at which they laughed heartily, and "'lowed we might be traders, too, anxious to get in ahead of them. But there's plenty of room on the river for you and we, stranger. Well, good luck to ye's. We'll see yer down below somewhere, I reckon." Just before lunch we were at Marietta, at the mouth of the Muskingum, 171 miles. A fine stream, here 250 yards wide. A storied river, this Muskingum. We first definitely hear of it in 1748, the year the original Ohio Company was formed. Celeron was here the year following, with his little band of French soldiers and Indians, vainly endeavoring to turn English traders out of the Ohio Valley. Christopher Gist came, some months later, then the trader Croghan, for Old Wyandotte Town, the Indian village at the mouth, was a noted center in western forest traffic. Moravian missionaries appeared in due time, establishing on the banks of the Muskingum the ill-fated convert villages of Schönbrunn, Gnadenhutten, and Salem. In 1785, Fort Harmar was reared on the site of Wyandotte Town. Lastly, in the early spring of 1788 came, in Ohio River flatboats, that famous body of New England veterans of the Revolution under General Rufus Putnam, and planted Marietta, the Plymouth Rock of the West. We smile at these Ohio pilgrims for dignifying the hills which girt in the Marietta bottom, with the names of the 7 on which Rome is said to be built, for having a Camp Martius and a Sacra Via and all that out here among the sycamore stumps and the wild Indians. But a classical revival was just then vigorously affecting American thought, and it would have been strange if these sturdy New Englanders had not felt its influence, fresh as they were from out of the shadows of Harvard and Yale, and in the awesome presence of crowds of huge monumental earthworks, whose age in their day was believed to far outdate the foundations of the eternal city itself. They loved learning for learning's sake, and here in the log cabins of Marietta, 800 miles west of their beloved Boston, among many another good thing that they did for posterity, they established the principle of public education at public cost, as a national principle. They were soldier colonists. Washington, out of a full heart, for he dearly loved the West, said of them, "No colony in America was ever settled under such favorable auspices as that which has just commenced at the Muskingum. Information, property, and strength will be its characteristics. I know many of the settlers personally, and there never were better men calculated to promote the welfare of such a community." And when, in 1825, Lafayette had read to him the list of Marietta pioneers, nearly 50 military officers among them, he cried, "I know them all. I saw them at Brandywine, Yorktown, and Rhode Island. They were the bravest of the brave." Yet, for a long time, Marietta met with small measure of success. Miasma, Indian ravages, and the conservative temperament of the people combined to render slow the growth of this western Plymouth. There were, for a time, extensive shipbuilding yards here, but that industry gradually declined, with the growth of the railway systems. In our day, Marietta, with its 10,000 inhabitants, prospers chiefly in a market town and an educational center, with some manufacturing interests. We were struck today, as we tarried there for an hour or two, with the remarkable resemblance it has in public and private architecture, and in general tone, to a typical New England town, say, for example, Burlington, Vermont. Omitting its river-front and its mound cemetery, Marietta might be bodily set down almost anywhere in Massachusetts, or Vermont, or Connecticut, and the chance traveler would see little in the place to remind him of the West. I know of no other town out of New England of which the same might be said. Below Marietta, the river bottoms are, for miles together, edged with broad stretches of sloping beach, either deep with sand or naturally paved with pebbles, sometimes treeless, but often strewn with clumps of willow and maple and scrub sycamore. The hills, now rounder, less ambitious, and more widely separated, are checkered with fields and forests, and the bottom lands are of more generous breadth. Pleasant islands stud the peaceful stream. The sylvan foliage has by this time attained very nearly its fullest size. The horse chestnut, the pawpaw, the grape, and the willow are in bloom. A gentle pastoral scene is this through which we glide. It is evident that it would be a scalding day but for the gentle breeze astern. Setting sail, we gladly drop our oars, and, with the water rippling at our prow, sweep blithely down the long southern reach to Parkersburg, West Virginia, at the mouth of the Little Kanawha, 183 miles. In the full glare of the scorching sun, Parkersburg looks harsh and dry, but it is well built, and as seen from the river, apparently prosperous. The Ohio is here crossed by the once famous $1,000,000 bridge of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. The wharf is at the junction of the two streams, but chiefly on the shore of the unattractive Little Kanawha, which is spanned by several bridges, and abounds in steamers and houseboats moored to the land. Clark and Jones did not think well of the Little Kanawha lands, yet there were several families on the river as early as 1763, and Trent, Croghan, and other Fort Pitt fur traders had posts here. There were only half a dozen houses in 1800, and Parkersburg itself was not laid out until 10 years later. Blennerhassett's Island lies 2 miles below, a broad, dark mass of forest, at the head joined by a dam to the West Virginia shore, from which it is separated by a slender channel. Blennerhassett's is some 3½ miles long. Of its 500 acres, 400 are under cultivation in 3 separate tenant farms. We landed at the upper end, where Blennerhassett had its wharf, facing the Ohio shore, and found that we were trespassing upon the Blennerhassett pleasure grounds. A seedy-looking man, who represented himself to be the proprietor, promptly accosted us and levied a lending fee of 10 cents per head, which included the right to remain overnight. A little questioning developed the fact that 30 acres at the head of the island belong to this man, who rents the ground to a market gardener, together with the comfortable farmhouse which occupies the site of Blennerhassett's mansion, but reserves to himself the privilege of leveling toll on visitors. He declared to me that 15,000 people came to the island each summer, generally in large railway and steamboat excursions, which gives him an easily acquired income sufficient for his needs. It is a pity that so famous a place is not a public park. The touching story of Blennerhassett's is one of the best known in Western annals. Rich in culture and worldly possessions, but wildly impracticable, Harmon Blennerhassett and his beautiful wife came to America in 1798. Buying this lovely island in the Ohio, 600 miles west of Tidewater, they built a large mansion, which they furnished luxuriously, adorning it with fine pictures and statuary. Here, in the midst of beautiful grounds, while Blennerhassett studied astronomy, chemistry, and galvanism, his brilliant spouse dispensed rare hospitality to their many distinguished guests. For, in those days, it was part of a rich young man's education to take a journey down the Ohio, into the western parts, and on returning home to write a book about it. But there came a serpent to this Eden. Aaron Burr was among their visitors, 1805, while upon his journey to New Orleans, where he hoped to set on foot a scheme to seize either Texas or Mexico, and set up a republic with himself at the head. He interested the susceptible Blennerhassetts in his plans, the import of which they probably little understood, but the fantastic Englishman had suffered a considerable reduction of fortune, and was anxious to recoup, and Burr's representations were aglow with the promise of such rewards in the golden Southwest as Cortez and Coronado sought. Blennerhassett's purse was open to the enterprise of Burr. Large sums were spent in boats and munitions, which were, tradition says, for a time hid in the bayou which, close by our camp, runs deep into the island forests. It has been filled in by the present proprietor, but its bold shorelines, all hung with giant sycamores, are still in evidence. President Jefferson's proclamation, October 1806, shattered the plot, and Blennerhassett fled to join Burr at the mouth of the Cumberland. Both were finally arrested, 1807, and tried for treason, but acquitted on technical grounds. In the meantime, people from the neighboring country sacked Blennerhassett's house. Then came creditors, and with great waste seized his property. The beautiful place was still further pillaged by lawless ruffians, and turned into ignoble uses. Later, the mansion itself was burned through the carelessness of negroes, and now, all they can show us are the old well and the noble trees which once graced the lawn. As for the Blennerhassetts themselves, they wandered far and wide, everywhere the victims of misfortune. He died on the island of Guernsey, 1831, a disappointed office-seeker. She, returning to America to seek redress from Congress for the spoliation of her home, passed away in New York before the claim was allowed, and was buried by the Sisters of Charity. End of chapter 8. Recording by Robert Hoffman.